Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well. As you know, Washington, D.C. is very divided. Congress seems to be constantly fighting, and the House and Senate, which once held to strict rules of decorum and respect, have more and more erupted into verbal fights, which more looks like the British Parliament than the Congress of the United States. However, this isn't the first time we've experienced such division or infighting in our nation. In fact, divisions were so prevalent we nearly lost our nation shortly after the end of the War for Independence. That division and our eventual unification came about in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, during the Constitutional Convention. This week, on September 17th, we will celebrate the 235th anniversary of the adoption of our Constitution. So this week, I want to share with you the story of that division that nearly cost us our nation, and more importantly, how we finally came together to adopt the Constitution. It had been 11 years after the Second Continental Congress had declared our independence from England that delegates from 12 of the 13 states had once again assembled in Philadelphia to consider a new form of government for our young nation. The Constitutional Convention, as it would become to known, had been in session for nearly 5 long and mostly unproductive weeks. And from all appearances, this would possibly be the final week. So far, little progress had been made because the delegates were deadlocked on many issues, with the most prominent being how each state should be represented in a new national government. The fighting became increasingly bitter with every session, as northern states argued that representation should be based solely on population, while the southern agricultural states argued that representation should be based on the amount of cultivated land. The representation issue also sparked arguments between small and large states. Small states demanded there be a fixed number of representatives from each state, regardless of size or population. Now, all sides were firm on their convictions, and none were willing to compromise. At the beginning of the convention, George Washington had been unanimously elected to serve as the president of the convention in hopes that the respect all delegates had for this hero of the Revolution would create a sense of unity. It was the dignity and statesmanlike demeanor of the former general that was responsible for holding the convention together thus far, but even Washington wondered how much more quarreling they could withstand before more delegates headed back to their home states. Washington, through a letter-writing campaign, had been one of the primary reasons this convention had taken place. In the years following the Revolution, disputes between the states had reached a critical level, and Washington proposed convening a Congress to resolve their differences. In May of 1786, Washington expressed his feelings in a letter to John Jay. He said, "There are errors in our national government which call for correction. Something must be done or the fabric will fall." Washington had fought hard for this convention, and as much as he wanted it to succeed, he maintained his dignity, remained reserved in his position as convention president. Washington refused to join the heated debates, and when he desired to make his opinions known, he would do so privately outside the convention chambers. On June the 28th, the convention took a catastrophic turn. Once again, the debates regarding representation ignited a fiery diatribe, which resulted in one of the small states threatening to leave the Confederation and ally itself with a foreign power. A delegate from one of the larger states immediately responded with the threat of using military force to keep the dissenting states in line. It was now inevitable. Everything our soldiers had fought and died for was crumbling down around them. Washington had commanded many of these brave patriots through 8 brutal years of war. Countless numbers of America's countrymen had given their lives for this new nation, and now the very convention that was supposed to design a new, stronger nation was, in reality, destroying it. To many of those in attendance, it seemed only a miracle could save the Union now, and unknowingly, a miracle was about to begin. George Washington was a man who was no stranger to miracles. During his service as the commander-in-chief of the Army, he had witnessed numerous accounts of unexplainable providence in his favor. Washington believed, as he documented in many letters and journals, that God had his hands on our cause, and these incidents were acts of God's divine intervention. Now, George Washington was in need of a new miracle, one that would change the current course of the convention. Without such a change, it seemed impossible that they would progress any further, and that all they had fought for during the war with Great Britain may have actually been in vain. Another highly respected statesman, the President of Pennsylvania, was also looking for a miracle that day. The 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin, who, like Washington, had also withheld comment throughout the entire convention, sensed that the hostility had brought them to a breaking point. He knew something must be done to save the convention, and he decided it was time to intervene. Gaining the attention of George Washington, he slowly stood to speak. As he rose, the room fell deathly quiet as the prominence of the elderly statesman captured the attention of everyone. His features were old, but his voice was strong and commanding, and his words reverberated throughout the chamber. Carefully leaning on his cane, Benjamin Franklin addressed the members of the convention. "Mr. President," Franklin began as he directed his opening statement to George Washington, "the small progress we have made after 4 or 5 weeks of close attendance and continual reasoning with each other, and our different sentiments on almost every question is, I believe, proof of the imperfection of human understanding. We indeed seem to feel our own want of political wisdom since we have been running about in search of it. In this situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we have not once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understanding? In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayers in this room for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in that struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. To that kind providence we owe this happy opportunity of consulting in peace on the means of establishing our future national felicity. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend, or do we imagine we no longer need his assistance? I have lived a long time, sir, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this, and I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. We shall be divided by our partial and local interests, our projects will be confounded, and we ourselves shall become a reproach and a byword down to future ages. And what is worse, mankind may hereafter from this unfortunate instance despair of establishing governments by human wisdom and leave it to chance, war, and conquest. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business, and that one or more of the clergy of the city be requested to officiate in that service." Franklin completed his remarks, and he returned to his seat. For some time the room remained quiet as everyone was moved with emotion. Franklin had openly rebuked the entire convention for their failure to corporately ask God for his guidance. Virtually every one of the delegates were active members of churches, and though some had sought private devotions, none had proposed praying together as a convention. Jonathan Dayton, a delegate from New Jersey, in reporting the reaction of the delegates to Franklin's remarks, stated, "The doctor sat down, and never did I behold a countenance at once so dignified and delighted as was that of Washington at the close of the address. Nor were members of the convention generally less affected. The words of the venerable Franklin fell upon our ears with a weight and authority." Mr. Roger Sherman, a delegate from Connecticut, moved by Franklin's admonition, promptly seconded his motion. A discussion ensued, and some of the delegates wanted to debate the matter. Those delegates were not opposed to Franklin's suggestion, but as Alexander Hamilton expressed, this was something they should have done at the beginning of the convention and still waiting until now. He argued that if they suddenly brought a member of the clergy into their daily deliberations, the public might get the idea that dissensions within the convention had called for such measures. Franklin, Sherman, and others argued that past omissions of such a duty could not justify further omission. Mr. Hugh Williamson of North Carolina brought to everyone's attention that the true reason that the clergy had not been included is that the convention had no funds to pay a chaplain. Mr. Edmund Randolph of Virginia offered a proposal. He suggested that a sermon be preached at the request of the delegates on July the 4th, the anniversary of independence, and that prayers be offered at the beginning of each day of the convention. Benjamin Franklin seconded that motion. A few days later, on July the 4th, 1787, in response to Franklin's appeal and Randolph's proposal, the majority of the members of the Constitutional Convention, led by George Washington, assembled at the Reformed Calvinistic Church in Philadelphia. Reverend William Rogers preached a sermon about trusting the wisdom of God to establish a free and vigorous government. Rogers' sermon filled the attendees with a new hope as he delivered these words. We fervently recommend to the fatherly notice our federal convention. Favor them from day to day with thy inspiring presence. Be their wisdom and their strength. Enable them to devise such measures as may prove happy instruments in healing all divisions and prove the good of the great whole. That the United States of America may form one example of a free and virtuous government. May we continue under the influence of Republican virtue to partake of all the blessings of cultivated and Christian society. When the convention reconvened in the following weeks, there was a new attitude among the delegates. Franklin's call for prayer had broken the deadlock that threatened to end the convention, and a new air of cooperation had replaced the spirit of dissension. Jonathan Dayton recorded this in his journal, that every unfriendly feeling had been expelled and a spirit of conciliation had cultivated. The Constitutional Convention went back to work, but this time the debates were civil and their differences were easily worked out through negotiations. On September the 17th, 1787, the final vote was called and the Constitution of the United States of America was formally adopted. This document, beginning with the words, "We the people," not only shaped a new nation, but ultimately changed the course of history for the entire world because of one man's call to prayer and the miracle of cooperation that resulted. The Constitution was not the only product that resulted from Franklin's call to prayer. When the First Constitutional Congress of the United States convened on April the 9th, 1789, one of the first actions of Congress was to formally enact Benjamin Franklin's recommendation made at the Constitutional Convention. Congress formally appointed 2 chaplains, one to the House and one to the Senate, and each was paid a salary from the national treasury. This tradition continues still today as every session of Congress is opened in prayer.